Okay, so I shared this out last week, so you all will be my second audience for this. And I do want to share a little bit of information, Nathan, to let you know and all your peers to know. Um, I don't have a lot of time, apparently, but I'm going to try. I think this is important to share. I started my program in 2014, and 2014 was a very interesting year because this was the year that our ACA Code of Ethics it was revised in 2014. Well, from 2011 to 2014, it was published in 2014. Prior to that, our last revision was 2005. So the year that I started my doc program, one of my first assignments was to read the new ACA Code of Ethics. And with that assignment, I noticed this revision. There was this revision related to duty to inform. And I was very concerned because working in public health in the past, I just felt like we are placing licensed professional counselors in jeopardy with this revision. And so my study will let you know more about this. And I remember I contacted someone through the board and through ACA to share my concern, and I was basically told, this is new, and the experts had already thought this through, and and I thought this would make a great this will be my focus for my dissertation one day. So this is something that I've been working on since 2014, either through my projects or through papers, and so this is where this emerged. And when you're in a doc program or a master's program, you write so many papers, you study so many subjects. So when you get to the end and it's time to do a thesis or a dissertation or something like that, you could go in any direction. I just recommend that you just follow your heart. And even if it looks like something like this has never been done before, I say go for it. So this is my effort of going for it, the thing that had never been studied before. So I've entitled this Justified Disclosure, and this is a phenomenological study exploring licensed professional counselors' experiences with breaking confidentiality. So I have an overview here, and this should look familiar to you because based on Dr. Stretch's course information tonight, this is some of the information that she let you know that you will be responsible for when you write papers, and you should know when you're doing qualitative studies, gathering qualitative data. So I won't belabor this, but I just want to share with you part of the reason why I did this is because, a lot of times when people come in for counseling, they're coming in because of emotional distress, things dealing with their mental health. But there are times when people come in because they are dealing with issues with disease and the stigma surrounding disease. And they may not have anyone else that they could talk to about it. And the beauty of counseling is that your counselor, you're going to come in and you'll have an opportunity to talk to someone about this this matter in a private and confidential way through counseling. And so we know that trust is the cornerstone of counseling. But a lot of times we don't think about the fact that counselors have duties to third parties. So this statement is very important. Counselors need to determine an optimal way to fulfill their obligation to protect identifiable third parties believed to be at serious and foreseeable risk of contracting a communicable and life-threatening disease from one of the counselor's clients. That's the focus. That's my introduction. That's the focus of my study. And I gave you all some background that, we had a new code of ethics, a revised code of ethics that came out in 2014. And the part that I was most concerned about is this part: counselors faced with a duty to inform may be justified in disclosing, information to third parties if the parties are at foreseeable risk of contracting the disease, ACA 2014. So counselors are expected to rely on their own interpretation of relevant state laws. But here in North Carolina, there's no statute for this. There's no statute for duty to warn, or this idea of duty to inform, protecting third parties from their clients. So based on my background, best practices and guidelines have not been created to address these circumstances. There's no information about that. There's no studies about this, and this is challenging our profession in a lot of ways, because your supervisors are not going to be able to help you. It's going to be hard to find consultation. Your professors are going to have difficulty with this because it's not spelled out, So even the most seasoned people would have questions about this. So my problem statement is professional counselors in North Carolina, and this may be in other states too, but I'm focused on North Carolina, do not have a standardized protocol for making a justified third-party disclosure, and opportunities for education and training to address this specific professional duty or responsibility do not currently exist. So my purpose, just to state it plainly, the purpose of this qualitative study was to investigate the revision to the 2014 ACA Code of Ethics, confidentiality and privacy section pertaining to communicable life-threatening diseases as it relates to understanding, application, and training needs of licensed professional counselors in North Carolina. Okay, so you'll see this all throughout my study, my research questions, everything. This is my focus, my purpose. So the significance of this, as I said, there's no information. I'm trying to fill a gap because there's no other study, there's no information about the current perceptions, experiences, and training needs of LPCs related to this revision to confidentiality and privacy. So these are my two research questions. My two research questions, just based on what I wanted to know, is what are licensed professional counselors' understanding and application of the revision to confidentiality and privacy section B2C? My second question is, what are the current training needs of licensed professional counselors in reference to the revision to confidentiality and privacy? So what I just shared with you, this is how I created my research questions based on that. And just to give you a little background, this may not relate to you all, but at NC State, when we get ready to do our comps, there's a special way that we do our comps, and it's focused on theories and studies, and we have to select a couple of theories that we analyze. And because I knew I had an idea about what I wanted to study for my dissertation, I just developed it during my my comp. And these two theories are well known in public health. And so what I'm interested in for this particular study, for my conceptual framework, and I want to say that most of the dissertations that I saw, they just focused on one theory, one theoretical framework. But because there were constructs from these two theories that would help me answer my question, if you look at the parts in red, this was my focus. I wanted to know about the beliefs of these licensed professional counselors, and specifically the most important beliefs they had related to their behavioral beliefs, their normative beliefs, and their control beliefs. And then there's this diffusion of innovation theory, and a part of that is this Rogers innovation decision process, and it's all about adoption of, like, for instance, this revision. I'm interested to know, like, are these licensed professional counselors adopting this, and at what rate or what stage are they in the adoption process? And so the dissemination stage includes knowledge and persuasion. Those are all mental stages, but with the adoption in the process, but adoption is like, did they really adopt or reject this? Are they implementing it? and that should be confirmation. Are they maintaining it? So moving forward, this is what you all have been learning about this week. So I use the phenomenological qualitative study and how in my data collection strategies. I wanted to learn more about their demographic information. I added some unique questions with the demographic questionnaire, and the individual written questionnaire also included that demographic questionnaire. So that's combined, even though it's two different things. And then we went into the focus groups. I always knew that I would do focus groups. I just didn't know how I was going to get that individual information. And one person on my committee, like I said, she was really big into those one-on-one interviews. I just didn't want to lose anyone when my bigger focus was the focus group, not gathering information through just interviews. And that's possible. If you spend time interviewing 15 people, they may decide, I don't want to be a part of your focus group. So the only way I can have a captive audience was to schedule my focus group, but also schedule my questionnaire, web-based questionnaire before it. So that was my rationale behind that. So moving forward, for my initial individual web-based questionnaire, it included, again, my informed consent. I was able to cover that in a written way, but I wanted to use it as the intro to getting onto my questionnaire, to make it clear that they agreed to be a part of it and they knew what they were getting into. And so I gathered the usual demographic information, but I also wanted to know things about their years of education and training. I wanted to know their professional counseling experience and their types and preferences of professional development and continuing education training, because one of my questions dealt with their training needs. I wanted to know more about the populations that they served in the past and in the present. And then moving forward, for the questionnaire, when we got deeper into the questionnaire, I showed you all that I wanted to know more about their salient, meaning their most important beliefs. I use these open-ended questions based on their behavioral, normative, and control beliefs. That was part of the way I developed the questionnaire. The next part of that questionnaire, I wanted to ask questions about their pre- and post-revision practices. This was important to me, even though it wasn't a big section. You guys, the reason why this question, when I was creating this, the reason why it was important to me is because this particular revision took place because I read in an article that said counselors never used this particular part of the code because they never really used it, it needed to be revised to make it easier for them to use it. And they didn't use it because they needed it. If someone came in and said that they had a disease and they were putting other people at risk, counselors were required to go to their medical doctor if they had the information and verify that the person's disease status. Well, doctors abide by HIPAA, and they're not just going to give you their patient's information. So counselors didn't really use this particular part of the code. And so I wanted to know how many counselors used it prior to the revision, and had it increased now that we have this revision, has it made it easier and better and just people are just using it? So that's why I had that question. And then I created these knowledge-based questions because I believe that counselors really had no idea about this disclosure process. What I'm referring to is justified disclosure. I know because I used to be a disease intervention specialist. I was a public health professional. We spent weeks training how to go out and discuss disease status with third parties, whether it was partners or other people at risk. Counselors are not given any of that information. They just got a revision that said you're justified in telling people. And there are a lot of nuances around telling someone this type of information. And when you see the types of questions that I pose to them, you'll get why this was so scary for me, and why this could be a huge legal issue for counselors. So again, my questions were based on the theory of planned behavior. And this looks familiar to you all. these are the constructs I wanted to focus on. And then for the focus groups, to collect the data from the focus groups, I came up with 12 questions. And I was talking to Dr. Stretch about this earlier. 12 is quite a bit. If you look back over like your course information from earlier, the focus was more on like up to like maybe 6 questions. There was like an introductory question and a closing question, and about 4 questions in between. And so I did have an intro question. I did have 5 other questions that were based on these 5. It was just very neat. I have a knowledge question, a persuasion question, a decision question, an implementation question, and a confirmation question. Please excuse the typos. And then for my closing question, I actually created 6 knowledge-based questions to gather information that I needed, and I was able to share those. I was able to collect that data both individually, and I collected both from the focus group. And so you'll see more about that. So the Rogers Innovation decision process that I discussed earlier with the dissemination and the adoption parts of this process, the stages here. For each stage, I have a question. So what I wanted to learn about the knowledge stage, and my participants, the overall theme of my participants being in the knowledge stage, to what extent are you familiar with the revision to confidentiality and privacy? This is how I gathered that information. For the persuasion stage, I asked them, what are your opinions of the revision to confidentiality and privacy? And looking at some model studies and questions that have been approved related to this particular theory and these constructs, that's where I got these questions from. They were developed from these stages of the Rogers Innovation Decision process. So I just want you to see where these questions came from here. And my introductory question was, I asked them, to what extent are you familiar with the ACA Code of Ethics? That was my intro question. And the other 5 questions are these questions. And my closing questions would be the knowledge-based questions, which I'll show you more about that in a moment.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yes, ma'am.
This is Renee.
Hi, Renee.
Hi. I'm wondering, when you asked about the subject's familiarity with that particular section, did you actually provide them with the text of that section, or did they have to recall that from their memory?
I am so glad you asked, because that ended up being something in my write-up. I had to speak about that as a limitation. I gave it to them. So, your question is great, because it really was one of the things that came up because I could have, as another part of my study, I could have just asked them, what is this revision? And make them, and it's, I could just ask them, do you know the revision to confidentiality and privacy section B2C? That could have been my very first question. And the answer would have been no, I have no idea. I don't know. And it would have gone along perfectly with the things I found out, the things that I learned. But and so that ended up being a limitation that we'll see. Like, great question. You guys are awesome, which Dr. Stretch said you all are awesome. So you're making me feel like maybe I did something right here, because it's cool. But yeah,
Great. Okay.
I did give it to them. So if I were to show you the actual questionnaire, this is listed at the top. So I just wanted to go. We only allotted 30 minutes for their questionnaire, and instead of making them just kind of like, oh my gosh, one person said, "Are you gonna take away my license?" I was like, "I didn't give it to you. I can't take it away," because they knew so little about this. But we'll keep going. So for data analysis, again, just like in your earlier information for the class for tonight, the transcript, the information was transcribed verbatim. And for the focus groups and the open-ended questionnaire, I used the qualitative content analysis, very similar to what Dr. Stretch shared with you when we looked at the bottom up information from raw data to the report, getting the information and as far as trustworthiness and credibility, similar to your earlier class slides. I use NVivo software to help me with this process, and MemberCheck, like what I shared with you all the data that I gathered, I went back to my participants and I asked them, are you in agreement with this? And I also shared that because I have a background in public health, I needed to be able to share that and bracket that because I'm coming in with some biases. I straight up told you all, this all began with me like, I cannot believe this revision exists. Like, I definitely had some feelings about it. And I needed to state that up front in my document and with my IRB board and with my committee and also with my participants. And again, applying what you all learned in class tonight, my sample selection, I use purposeful sampling. And so I just wanted to share with you all this idea of what goes into that, the selection of the study participants. This is out of your book, or at least out of my 2013 book. The specific type of sampling strategy, the size of the sample, and I'll share it with you now. I use criterion sampling because remember, everyone had to be a LPC with a non-restricted independent license, and I verified it through the North Carolina Board of Licensed Professional Counselors. So that was the criteria. I use snowball sampling, and I'm gonna be honest with you all. I was like, oh my gosh, one person on my committee said, I don't think you're going to get a soul to participate in your study. Like, these LPCs go to work all week, and who's going to come on the weekends and, participate in this for you? And I just don't think you're going to be able to get, because remember, my goal was to get at least 10 people and no less than 5. And it was difficult, but I started out with LPCs that I knew through academic and professional affiliation. And through that, I was able to verify those people through the board and people through local council centers and people that I could basically find their information online and access them locally. And by the time I contacted them through their telephone numbers and email addresses and the information that was available about them publicly, I offered them an invitation. And I also asked them, did they know other LPCs that might be eligible for this study, LPCs in good standing? And then I repeated that process with those people. So that's the idea about snowball sampling, which you'll see that in your book. So I ended up with 10 participants. It's so funny. I say I should do a study on the excuses people give you once they commit to you. I had 17 people, and 4 of those people let me know maybe a week or 2 before the study they wouldn't be able to participate. And then we went on, and on the day of the study, 3 people backed out, and it ended up being 5 and 5. So I have 2 focus groups, and there are 5 participants in each focus group, okay? So these are my findings, and I'm going to go through these kind of quickly because we are at 9 o'clock, and I think I'm supposed to be finished at, is it 9 o'clock? 9:20, okay, so I have 20 minutes. Okay, 20 minutes to get it in. All right, here we go. All right, so when you're working with participants, you would give them a pseudonym. So that was kind of fun, making up names for these people. And so of my participants, Barbara was the only person who earned a PhD. Everyone else, being an LPC, they were all master's level people. And several of these people were in a doctoral program, a local doctoral program. And so experience ranged from 3 years. You'll see with Martin, he has 3 years of experience, and he's also the youngest one. He's 31. To 12 years of experience with Barbara, who has the doctorate. But we also have Vanessa, who's 67. and Jerry, who's 65. So we have a range of age and experience, and the populations that they serve, many of them have served children, adults, and some people more specifically, clients in crisis, domestic violence survivors, college students. And so remember, I wanted to know, because one of my questions is related to training. I want to know what types of positions they've held, and they've been outpatient, inpatient therapists, school counselors, and I was curious about their leadership as well. We've had people who were the president of the Counseling Honor Society and editors of a counseling journal. And I asked this question over here. I wanted to know what types of training have they had in the past, like after they were licensed, after they completed their master's, and then after they were licensed. And many of them had couples counseling training and training related to trauma and those types of things. But I also wanted to know, what do they think would be most helpful to them in future training? And I got responses like social justice and advocacy and autism spectrum disorder training. No one mentioned this issue as something that they ever had training on before, and no one mentioned it as something they wanted to have training on. So this goes back to I'm sorry, what was your name, the lady? Renee? Was it Renee?
Yes, it was me.
So Renee, like, this is an example of, I asked them something, I asked them about training to try to get something from them without giving them something ahead of time. You know what I'm saying? I was trying to pull from them, like, what have you already had, and what do you think you need, without saying to them, don't you think you need to know about this duty to inform? So, and I it shows here it wasn't even on their radar. This was part of demographic information. This was before I actually gave them the information about duty to inform. This was a part of demographic information. When I asked them, like, the ways they like to be trained, they mentioned, live counseling observations, conferences, workshops, and online training as their preferred delivery format. So just jumping into this, as far as like the most important behavioral beliefs, speaking to advantages that they say related to this revision, the overall idea was this sense of responsibility to community. So they mentioned protection of the community, specifically protecting innocent people from being harmed, as well as protecting public health, identified individual health, and identifiable other from a life-threatening illness. They list all these as advantages for this revision. And over here, we won't go through these, but these are some of the quotes from Colette, Martin, Vanessa, related to what I just shared with you over here. Some disadvantages that they share about the revision, the idea around this concern for the counseling relationship. Specifically, they discuss damage to the counselor and client rapport, damage to trust in the counseling relationship, and consequences if the client feels reluctant to review or disclose information in session. Counseling doesn't work well if if they want to talk to you. I mean, so yeah, that they felt these are the disadvantages of this revision. So when we talk about the most important normative beliefs, and we start looking at influencers of their understanding and their use, some potential influencers that they discuss, they mentioned qualified professionals and care coordinators and clinical directors and supervisors and mentors and professors and instructors and colleagues and coworkers, family members. These people could be potential people to help them understand, to influence their understanding and use. But most of them said that, the person who influenced their understanding and use was this researcher, me, that I was their greatest actual person to influence them, either through things that I said in class or presentations in the community or things like that. So as far as barriers to their understanding, where we're looking at their most important control beliefs, and we look at barriers to their understanding of the revision, we're looking at they discussed the lack of awareness about the revision. They just didn't have information about it. They didn't even know it existed, even though they're responsible for knowing what's happening with the ACA Code of Ethics. They just really didn't know about this particular revision specifically. And some of those barriers to their understanding included limited training, limited communication of changes between professionals, like their peers. No one talked about it. Lack of familiarity with the code, not knowing the revision. And one person said, I just admit, I don't even remember what the last one said. I don't know what this one said, and I don't know what the last one said. And absence of clarity on wording. Because some people are saying, I'm familiar with it, but, it's not very clear for me, like what I'm supposed to do with it. So then, under the most important control beliefs, when we talk about enablers to understanding a revision, they basically report they have no idea what would help them enable them to understand this revision. But many of them said that they believe that consulting with the ACA website, because this is where we would go anyway if we wanted to know something. So they said, consulting with the ACA website, providing an example to accompany this. So like when you open up the ACA Code of Ethics and you read section B2C, why don't they just go ahead and put an example in there that could be helpful? And also discussing the fine points of the guidelines and how to apply them to new situations in therapy. They're saying this would enable them to understand this revision better. And we see some quotes over here. So also under important control beliefs, barriers to applying the revision. And all of these themes and this information I'm sharing with you are born from the diffusion of innovations, Rogers innovation decision process, which is where these questions were born from. So I'm giving you the results of those. I'm sorry, no, it's not. We're still in theory of planned behavior. I'm jumping ahead. We're still in theory of planned behavior because we're talking about beliefs right now. Excuse me. Back to barriers to applying revision. So the barriers that they discuss about applying this revision, they go back to lack of information about this revision. So they say there's too little information or guidance. There's ambivalence over the revision. There's limited communication among peers. Nobody's talking about it. There's lack of ability to help clients to understand the application because they don't know about it. Knowing the expected extent one should go to access a third party. They don't know how far they're to go or what they're to say once they get to a third party. And some people say that one barrier to this applying the revision is that they work with children or minors. And what I want to say to you is that communicable life-threatening diseases, children could have those as well. But I'll talk to you later about how so many counselors focus on one particular disease or they focus on STDs, and they make this assumption that if I work with children, this doesn't have anything to do with children, right? So we're still dealing with these assumptions that may not be, very, they're working against the counselor. Enablers to applying the revision. The participants share that a variety of potential enablers to applying this will be the ACA training, workshops, and more education. So remember those pre and post revision practices. Only one of my 10 LPCs stated that they were ever in a position where they were able to act upon their duty to inform prior to this revision. And after the revision, 2 people said that they were in a position, but only one person said they actually acted upon it. The other person said they suspected that this person was placing people at risk, but they ended the counsel sessions prematurely and they never gathered information about the third party. They just had a feeling that this is leading toward that. So basically 1 and 1, and one person who kind of thinks I probably was in a position where I could have acted on duty to inform if I had more information about the third party. So the individual knowledge-based questions from my web-based questionnaire, what I learned is that they were really unsure about how to answer these questions. They had no idea when they were placed in these positions, and it took me a while to develop these questions. I knew what I wanted to ask them, what would really matter if they were in a position to have to reach out to these third parties if they felt justified. And so the participants shared that research and training and consultation would help to increase or enhance their knowledge about this. And all 10 of them were very clear that they felt it was unethical for counselors to notify identifiable third parties placed at risk for contraction of a life-threatening communicable disease by their current client, and then to subsequently accept the identifiable third party as a client. That was one of my questions for them. If you felt that you were justified in going out telling someone and you're giving them this information and they're distraught, is it ethical for you then to take them on as a client? And all of them agreed that's unethical for me to do that, okay? So of my focus group findings, what I was about to tell you prematurely, based on the fusion of innovations theory and Rogers. So the content analysis, I used this Binkson 2016, those stages that I use for the content analysis, the decontextualization, recontextualization, categorization, and compilation. There's a description of what I did here, and I want to show you what that looked like with my study. So an example content analysis schedule that I use to help you see how that works. So like going back to either my focus group or going back to the individual web-based questionnaire, we'll take Wendy. And Wendy made the statement, I have no idea what you mean by that. One of the knowledge-based questions I asked was about like billing for this, going out talking to the third party. And Wendy says, I have no idea what you mean by that. Like compensation, I'm asking, should you be compensated for it? How are you compensated for it? She said, like compensation, is that a billable activity? And so my code became don't know. The sub-theme was lack of information. And the theme that came out of that, the overall larger theme, is deprivation of information. I'm just giving you an example, and I'll show you more information about this in a minute. Clara made a statement, I would not disclose the client's name. So one of the knowledge-based questions dealt with how much information you would share. And Clara said, I would not disclose the client's name. I would give the person the name of the disease and give them resources on where they could be treated. So the code became not disclose client's name. The sub-theme is she's showing she has a responsibility to the client. And the theme, the overarching theme that I came up with is responsibility to others. So this is just an example, and I'm going to show you. When I use Rogers Innovation Decision Process, and you all remember I've already shown you this process, the stages and the questions that came from it. When I went back and reviewed it, the most frequently coded responses that came from question 1 about knowledge is they just weren't aware of the revision at all. They were not aware of the revision. For the persuasion stage, when I say, what are your opinions of the revision? They said there are no clear guidelines to it. And there's an error in this slide, and I'll tell you what it is. So where it says the decision to adopt or reject, and I asked them to what extent would you say that you have adopted or rejected? That part there shouldn't be there. It says include an informed consent. They did not adopt this. Because they weren't aware of it. But under implementation, when I asked, what could you tell each other about the way you currently apply? They don't currently apply this, but they said what they could do if they did, which was a great finding for my study. They said we could include it in our informed consent, And we could also include it as part of our disclosure statement. And when I asked them about confirmation, what kind of support do you need to apply or use the revision, they said they don't know. Because remember, they weren't aware of it. There are no clear guidelines on how to use it. And they haven't adopted it. So when I'm looking at where they are in the adoption process, they're really stuck up in like the mental stages because they're not even aware of it. They've never adopted it. They never got down to the adoption stage, which is part of my finding. So let's go on to themes and sub-themes. So I was telling you all about my overall themes. I have 2 themes that came out of looking at all this information. And my first theme, deprivation of information. And this is how I got this, some examples of how I got this. So go back to the question, to what extent are you familiar with the revision, the confidentiality? Jerry said, I was not aware of those changes prior to coming here today. This is just one example of what many people said. And that's how I came up with the sub-theme, lack of information, under the theme, deprivation of information. When I asked them, what are your experience with the 2014 APA Code of Ethics? Remember, I said I had an intro question before I got into the revision. And Barbara, we know that she's the only one with the doctorate. She said, I actually teach that course to my graduate students, and I love it, but I don't know anything about this particular topic. So that I came up with the sub-thing, they have limited resources. And when I asked the question, how do counselors determine which, and many people refer to limited resources. That's how it became a theme and a sub-theme. Not just this one person. This is just an example response for many people. And when I asked the question, how do counselors determine which diseases are both communicable and life-threatening? Wendy said, Google was the first thing that popped into my mind. It popped into my head. And Colette said, I would search the internet and probably consult with someone I know from the medical profession. So that's how I came up with this idea for search for information. We have a couple of minutes left, and I know y'all have an activity, so I'm going to kind of press through this really quickly. I did the same process with how I came up with responsibility to others. And my sub-themes for responsibility to others, based on what they shared, I found responsibility to clients, responsibility to community, responsibility to the profession. And you can see here some of the responses that they gave of how I showed you examples of how I was able to come to these themes and sub-themes. So some of my key findings, based on some of the theories, because they were all in the mental stages, I didn't get a lot of information about the decision, implementation, and confirmation stages. And what I realized also with the theory of planned behavior, it's known that the time frame between intent and behavioral action is not addressed with that theory, but it was clear that with my participants, they expressed urgency and concern about we really need to have the guidelines and the trainings related to this for ethical and legal reasons. So those are the types of findings. This is kind of fun because you may be asked to report your unanticipated findings. I had no idea that most of the people would say that I was the influence for their understanding, and that I shouldn't say application because they're not applying it, but for the people who had any understanding about that, when I worked on this, I didn't think I would come out in this way. The second thing is I want to show you all the sample response comparison of those 6 knowledge-based questions. Those 6 knowledge-based questions that I asked them both individually and collectively in the focus group. So we have Martin, the 31-year-old. He's the youngest one in our group with the 3 years of experience. And when I'm asking him things like how do counselors determine which diseases are both communicable and life-threatening, he basically says, I know because I'm a counselor. Counselors know these things. Counselors know which diseases are communicable and life-threatening because of medical research. That's how I know I'm a counselor. So it's like he poses the question again, he uses circular reasoning, and he just doesn't really answer the question. And he never, ever, in the individual written responses, he will never say, I don't know. He'll say something, but it won't be, I don't know. He gives an answer. So let's move on. It says, how do counselors determine justification of disclosure to third parties? That's what I'm asking them. Individually, Martin says, if the counselor feels that the third party is at risk or any harm may be done, that's his answer. But when he's with the focus group, he says, I'm not sure. When I ask him questions independently about how the counselors ensure their personal safety when informing third parties or persons at risk, he gives an answer. You know, you should take someone with you. But then when you ask him with the group, he says, I'm not sure. When I ask him about compensation, he says, I don't think they're financially compensated. They're mentally compensated by knowing that they did the legal and ethical thing. But when I ask him in the group, he says, I don't know if there's any compensation. And I'll leave you with this one. These were the 6 questions asked individually and in focus group. I asked him, how much identifiable information does the counselor share about the client? Over here, he says, the counselor only shares the information regarding the communicable disease. The counselor should not share information about the client during the notification process. Great answer, right? But he's guessing. Because when he gets with the focus group, he says, I assume it would be you would not want to share information that could be traced back to your client. But just like Colette said, I would tell the name of the person and the disease. And you would never tell the name of the person. But, you know, he kind of changed the answer because he's trying, you know. And when he's with the group, he's greatly influenced by the group, and it's clear he's really not clear about this. So I share information about practice. You know, they're willing to adopt this through informed consent and disclosure statements. We need a more organized way to get this information out about revisions. I give implications about the theory, which I share some of that with you, like what we know about the theory and the urgency that my participants show in meeting this. And I also give some implications about diffusion and innovation theory and how, you know, we don't have a lot of information about the later stages. I give more information about theory. I give implications about policy and how, you know, I really believe that it would be helpful if we use duty to report instead of duty to inform. Very similar to what physicians do. They're able to report instead of inform, even if they ordered the test about the disease. I also talk about implications for advocacy. So many counselors have ideas about HIV, and people with HIV, they're protected, but, you know, we're not using HIV, but people always assume we're talking about HIV. And, you know, there's room for us to advocate for people, whether they have HIV or other diseases, to make sure that they're treated fairly. And so I discussed that here. And I also talk about the possibility of advocating for the profession by advocating for us to be able to report to our health department versus, you know, this focus on duty to inform, being justified in informing third parties without any real way of knowing how to do it properly. And going back to what I said about physicians, they report to public health officials. We should be able to do that. And so there was a part in your classroom portion tonight where we talked about limitations. I made reference to this earlier. You know, this is qualitative. It was exploratory in nature. This is not something we would generalize to all LPCs. And then delimitations, things I could control. I chose to do a web-based questionnaire instead of interviews. I chose to work with LPCs in North Carolina, not in Kentucky. You know, I chose these theories, and I assumed that my participants were giving me honest answers. I give some recommendations related to education and training and all those sorts of things. And I recap some of the things that I shared with you all earlier. And